What was the Berlin Conference, and why did it matter? In November 1884, in the Wilhelmstrasse Palace in Berlin, the official residence of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, 13 European nations gathered around a table. They spread a map of Africa across that table. They had rulers and pens, and over the next 3 months, they drew lines across that map, dividing the entire continent of Africa among themselves. 13 European powers. 0 African representatives. Not a single African ruler, diplomat, scholar, or person was invited, consulted, or informed. This was the Berlin Conference, also known as the Congo Conference or the West African Conference. And the 3 months it lasted, November 15, 1884 to February 26, 1885, produced consequences that are still shaping the world you live in today. The borders that 54 African nations share today were drawn at or after Berlin. The colonial languages that are official in those 54 nations, English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Arabic, Italian, were imposed as a result of what Berlin set in motion. The economic extraction structures that made Europe wealthy while leaving Africa poor. The political fragmentation that has produced decades of post-colonial conflict. The psychological legacy of a continent told that it was incapable of governing itself. All of this traces back to one conference table in Berlin in 1884. And understanding what happened at that table, and why, is essential to understanding the world we live in now. Welcome to Griot Wave Academy. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind Griot Wave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. Griot Wave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. Before we go into the conference itself, let me situate it in its historical context. Because the Berlin Conference makes no sense without understanding what came before it, what happened during it, and what came after it. Before 1880, the slave trade had been running for 400 years. European powers had coastal footholds in Africa, but had not penetrated the interior. African kingdoms controlled approximately 90% of the continent. The interior was, from a European perspective, largely unknown. The trigger for the conference was competition between European powers over who would control the Congo River Basin and West African territory. King Leopold II of Belgium had begun a private project in the Congo, claiming it for himself personally, through a front organization called the International Association of the Congo. France was expanding rapidly in West Africa. Britain was alarmed. Germany wanted a seat at the colonial table. Bismarck, Germany's chancellor, one of the most sophisticated political operators of the 19th century, proposed a conference in Berlin to regulate the competition. The stated purpose was to promote, quote, free trade and the well-being of African peoples. The actual purpose was to prevent European war over African territory, and to establish rules for the colonization that all the powers intended to pursue. The conference met for 3 months and produced the General Act, a legal document that shaped the following 3 decades of African history catastrophically. Within 30 years of Berlin, 90% of Africa was under European colonial rule. This is one of the most dramatic geopolitical transformations in human history, and it was built on what was agreed in Berlin. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, the man who unified Germany and organized the conference that divided Africa. And it's important to understand Bismarck's motivations, because they reveal exactly how the conference was designed and why. Bismarck had essentially no personal interest in Africa. His famous remark, pointing to a map of Germany and saying, "Here is Russia, and here is France, and we are in the middle. That is my map of Africa," captures his orientation perfectly. Africa, for Bismarck, was a space where European power rivalries could be played out. The actual continent, its people, its history, its sovereignty, these were not factors in his calculations. So why did he call the conference? European reasons. First, to prevent a European war. By 1884, Britain and France were on a collision course in West Africa and the Congo. Germany and Portugal had competing claims. Without a framework for resolving disputes, these competing claims could escalate into direct European military conflict, something Bismarck desperately wanted to avoid. Second, to establish Germany as a colonial power. Germany had been unified only in 1871 and had entered the colonial competition late. Bismarck saw colonies as markers of great power status, necessary for Germany's international prestige, even if not immediately economically valuable. Third, to create a legal framework for the colonization that all the powers intended to pursue anyway. Africa was, from Bismarck's perspective, simply a problem to be managed between European powers. The continent's 300 million people were irrelevant to his calculations. This is not a peripheral detail. It is the core of the conference's moral failure. 13 powers were in the room at Berlin. Let me introduce the key players, because understanding who they were and what they wanted helps explain what the conference produced. Britain, the dominant power, with existing colonies across Africa and a grand vision of a continuous Cape to Cairo British Empire. Britain attended Berlin to protect what it already had and position for what it wanted next. France, Britain's primary rival in Africa. France already controlled Algeria and was expanding across the Sahel. The French-British competition was the immediate trigger for the conference, and it was resolved by giving each power defined spheres of influence rather than allowing them to fight over territory. Germany, the host, with no existing African colonies. Bismarck used the conference to establish Germany's right to participate in colonial Africa. Germany emerged with 4 territories, including what would become the site of the Herero and Nama genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century. Belgium/King Leopold II, the conference's most cynical participant. Leopold presented himself as a humanitarian philanthropist. He had formed something called the International Association of the Congo, with no Belgian government involvement, and he used this front organization to claim the Congo for himself personally. The conference gave him what he wanted, 2.3 million square kilometers as his personal property. What followed was one of history's greatest crimes. Portugal, the oldest European presence in Africa, but now a declining power, defending existing claims rather than expanding. The United States, present as an observer. No African colonies, but its endorsement of the proceedings added American legitimacy to what was happening. Let me take you inside the conference room, because the physical reality of what happened matters. The Wilhelmstrasse Palace in Berlin. A grand formal room. 13 delegations of European diplomats. Military uniforms. Formal protocols. The entire diplomatic apparatus of 19th century European power assembled. And on the central table, a map of Africa. This map was, by the standards of the time, relatively incomplete. The interior of Africa was not well mapped by Europeans. The great era of interior exploration, with figures like Livingstone and Stanley, had only recently begun. So these European powers were drawing borders across territory they did not know, governed by people they had not met, containing populations they did not understand. The negotiations proceeded over 3 months and 14 formal sessions. The key issues were, who controls the Congo Basin? What makes a colonial claim legitimate, mere declaration, or actual presence? How do powers notify each other to avoid inadvertent conflict? And the humanitarian pretense. Article 6 of the General Act required colonial powers to, quote, protect and favor, without distinction of nationality or of worship, all institutions and enterprises created and organized for the purpose of improving the moral or material condition of the native populations. This article was never enforced. It was diplomatic language designed to give the conference a veneer of moral justification. The participants knew and later admitted that the conference was not about the well-being of Africans. It was about European commercial interests, European rivalry, and the legal ordering of European expansion. Africa was the prize, not the purpose. And throughout the 3 months, not a single African voice. Not one. I want to spend a moment on Africa before Berlin, because one of the most powerful myths that justified the conference was the idea that Africa was an ungoverned wilderness that needed European order. This is historically false. In 1880, approximately 90% of Africa was under African governance. Not 10%, not 50% to 90%. The European presence in Africa in 1880 was primarily coastal, trading posts, forts, small administrative colonies at key ports. The interior of Africa was governed by Africans. The Ethiopian Empire, with a history stretching back to ancient Aksum, was one of the world's oldest continuous Christian kingdoms. It had a sophisticated court, a professional military, and diplomatic relations with both European and Islamic powers. When Italy attempted to colonize it in 1896, Ethiopia's army defeated the Italian force at Adwa in one of the most decisive military victories in 19th century history. This was not a, quote, primitive society being rescued by European civilization. The Zulu kingdom, just 5 years before Berlin, had demonstrated at the Battle of Isandlwana that African military organization could defeat a well-equipped British force. 1,300 British soldiers were killed in that battle. The Zulu military system was sophisticated, disciplined, and tactically innovative. The Ashanti Kingdom in West Africa had fought 4 wars against British expansion, had a complex constitutional system balancing royal and noble authority, and maintained commercial networks that stretched across West Africa. None of this was acknowledged at Berlin. African political systems were not treated as legitimate sovereignties requiring consent. They were treated as obstacles to be managed or absorbed. The conference's legal framework simply erased African sovereignty from consideration. The General Act of the Berlin Conference, signed on February 26, 1885, is the document that formally established the legal framework for European colonization of Africa. It has 38 articles, and I want to walk you through the most important ones. Article 1 established the principle of free navigation on the Congo and Niger rivers. open to all signatories. This was ostensibly about commerce, but it also established a legal justification for European presence deep in the African interior. Article 6 is the humanitarian pretense. It required colonial powers to, quote, protect and favor all institutions created for the moral and material improvement of native populations. This article was never enforced. Not once. It was diplomatic decoration, language designed to give the conference moral respectability without creating any actual obligation. Article 34 is the most consequential. The effective occupation doctrine. To claim a territory as a colonial possession, a European power had to demonstrate, quote, effective occupation, actual administrative presence. You couldn't just declare a territory yours from a distance. You had to be there, with administrators, military forces, courts. This article was, in practice, the starter gun for the Scramble for Africa. It meant that every European power that wanted to maintain or expand its African claims had to physically invade and occupy African territory, or risk losing those claims to rivals. It converted the slow coastal colonialism of the previous 400 years into a frantic race for interior territory. And the African consent question. The Act contains not one reference to obtaining African consent to any of its provisions. African rulers were not parties to the Act. African sovereignty was not a concept the Act needed to address, because within the document's legal framework, African sovereignty did not exist. The effective occupation doctrine is the most consequential single provision of the Berlin Conference, and it's the one most responsible for the speed and violence of the scramble that followed. Before Berlin, European colonial claims were often nominal. A ship's captain planted a flag on a beach. A company signed a, quote, treaty with a local chief that the chief may not have understood as ceding sovereignty. A trading post was established at a river mouth. These claims were often vague, contested, and based on minimal actual presence. The effective occupation doctrine changed this entirely. To claim a territory, you had to demonstrate actual administrative presence. Courts, tax collection, military garrison, some form of governance. You couldn't just declare it yours from a distance. On the surface, this sounds reasonable, even principled. In practice, it was catastrophic for Africa. Why? Because it required every European power that wanted to maintain or expand its African claims to physically invade and occupy African territory. Immediately, before rival powers could establish their own effective occupation. The result, a frantic race across the African interior, conducted primarily by military force. The Maxim gun, the world's first self-powered machine gun, invented in 1884, the same year as the Berlin Conference, played a decisive role in this race. European forces armed with Maxim guns could inflict devastating casualties on African armies armed with older weapons. The technological asymmetry of the scramble was extreme. Hilaire Belloc captured it in verse. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. Grim, accurate, and revealing about the actual mechanism by which the conference's legal framework was implemented on African soil. The results of what Berlin set in motion are staggering in their speed and completeness. In 1880, 4 years before the conference, approximately 90% of Africa was under African governance. This is not a disputed historical claim. It's the consensus view of historians who study the period. European presence was primarily coastal, trading posts, forts, and a few administrative colonies at key ports. By 1914, just 34 years later, 90% of Africa was under European colonial rule. This is one of the most dramatic geopolitical transformations in the history of the modern world. No other continent experienced anything like this scale and speed of external takeover. Britain acquired approximately 30% of the continent. France acquired approximately 35%, the largest single share if you include North Africa. Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, and Spain divided the remainder. And the two exceptions, Ethiopia and Liberia, are enormously instructive. Ethiopia survived because it defeated Italy's colonial army at Adwa in 1896. This is the proof by exception. An African state that was fully functional, militarily capable, and politically cohesive could resist European colonial invasion. Ethiopia's sovereignty was not given by European goodwill. It was maintained by Ethiopian military power. Liberia survived because of its unique relationship with the United States, founded by freed African American slaves, with American political investment in its continued independence. Every other African state was colonized, not because Africa was incapable of self-governance. The pre-Berlin record of African states proves otherwise, but because European military technology, particularly the Maxim gun, gave invading forces an overwhelming tactical advantage, and the Berlin Conference provided the legal framework that organized the invasion. 0. Not one African representative in the room. Not one African voice heard in 3 months of deliberations about the future of Africa. This is the Berlin Conference's most fundamental moral failure, and it is important to understand that it was deliberate, not accidental. The participants at Berlin were not unaware that Africa had political leadership. They knew Menelik II existed. Ethiopia was one of the oldest Christian kingdoms in the world. They knew the Ashanti Kingdom existed. They had been fighting wars with it for decades. They knew the Zulu Kingdom existed. They had fought and nearly lost to it at Isandlwana just 5 years earlier. They didn't invite African representatives because they didn't think African sovereignty was a legitimate concept that needed to be acknowledged. This was the operative ideology of European colonialism. African peoples were not at a stage of political development that entitled them to sovereign representation in international proceedings affecting their lives and territories. This ideology was not just wrong, it was demonstrably false by the evidence available at the time. But it was the consensus view of European intellectual culture in the 1880s, reinforced by scientific racism, social Darwinism, and the commercial interests of the people who stood to profit from colonization. Consider the legal absurdity from our contemporary perspective. 13 nations, meeting in a country 5,000 kilometers from Africa, making binding decisions about the governance of a continent, without consulting a single person who lived there. By every principle of contemporary international law, including the UN Charter's principle of self-determination, what happened at Berlin was invalid at its foundation. The empty chair in this slide represents 300 million people. Their absence was a choice, not an oversight. King Leopold II of Belgium is perhaps the Berlin Conference's most important and most horrifying character, and his case illustrates perfectly how the conference's humanitarian pretense and legal framework enabled mass murder. Leopold was brilliant. He understood that the Berlin Conference's humanitarian language could be weaponized. He created a front organization, the International Association of the Congo, that claimed to be fighting the Arab slave trade and bringing civilization to the Congo Basin. He lobbied American politicians personally. He funded Henry Morton Stanley's exploration of the Congo as a commercial and political exercise. At Berlin, his performance was convincing enough to earn recognition of his personal sovereignty over the Congo Free State, 2.3 million square kilometers of Central Africa, as his personal property. Not Belgium's colony, his personal estate. What followed is one of the worst crimes in modern history. Leopold's Congo was run as a rubber extraction machine. The wild rubber that grew in Congo's forests was enormously valuable. This was before synthetic rubber, and rubber was as critical to late 19th century industrial technology as oil is today. Leopold extracted this rubber through systematic terror. Congolese people were given quotas they had to meet. If they failed, the Force Publique, his private army, administered punishment. The most notorious punishment, the severing of hands. Soldiers were required to submit a severed hand for every bullet used, proving the bullet had been spent on punishment, not wasted on hunting. The result, baskets of severed hands submitted as administrative records. Approximately 10 million Congolese died between 1885 and 1908, roughly half the pre-colonial population. The Berlin Conference's legal framework made this possible by giving one man personal sovereignty over 2.3 million square kilometers without a single Congolese consultation. The borders drawn at and after the Berlin Conference are the most persistent and most destructive of the conference's legacies. They are the immediate cause of a significant proportion of contemporary African political conflict. And they were drawn with stunning disregard for the actual human geography of the continent. Let me be precise about this. The Europeans who drew these borders were, in many cases, drawing lines across maps they could barely read, through territory they had never visited, dividing peoples they had never met. The 1890 border between British and German East Africa, which is now part of the Tanzania-Kenya border, was drawn in a straight line from the coast to Lake Victoria. A straight line. Someone with a ruler. Across the territories of Maasai, Kikuyu, and dozens of other peoples who had been managing their own affairs for centuries. The Yoruba, one of West Africa's most numerous peoples, with a sophisticated cultural, religious, and commercial tradition, divided by the British-French border between Nigeria and Dahomey. Yoruba families on opposite sides of that border became citizens of different countries, with different colonial languages, different legal systems, different educational structures. The Somali, divided among 5 colonial jurisdictions. The same people, the same language, the same nomadic culture that moved across the Horn of Africa according to the rhythms of rainfall and pastoralism, suddenly legally required to respect borders that made no sense in terms of how they actually lived. The Somali conflicts of the 20th century, the Ogaden Wars, the collapse of the Somali state, traced to these divisions. 177 cultural groups, divided by colonial borders. 177. This is not an abstract statistic. Each one represents a specific community, whose social fabric was cut by a line drawn without their knowledge or consent. Britain was the largest single beneficiary of the Berlin Conference's framework. Not necessarily because it gained the most territory at the conference itself, but because it was best positioned to follow the framework's logic. Cecil Rhodes is the embodiment of British imperial ambition in post-Berlin Africa. Rhodes said, and this is an actual quote, I would annex the planets if I could. He was a diamond and gold mining magnate who became Prime Minister of Cape Colony, founded the British South Africa Company that colonized what is now Zimbabwe and Zambia, which he named Rhodesia after himself, and drove the Cape to Cairo vision that shaped British African policy for decades. Britain's African acquisitions in the post-Berlin period were enormous. Egypt and the Sudan in the northeast, East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, now Tanzania, West Africa, Nigeria, Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, and continued expansion in southern Africa. At its peak, the British African Empire covered approximately 9 million square kilometers. What Britain extracted from this empire? Gold from the Rand goldfields in South Africa, discovered in 1886, 1 year after Berlin, transforming the economic stakes of southern African control and triggering the Boer War. Diamonds from Kimberley. Cotton from Egypt and the Sudan, critical to Manchester's textile mills. Cocoa from the Gold Coast, the foundation of the global chocolate industry. Labor from everywhere, through a combination of forced and coerced work systems. The South African War, the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, was fought primarily for control of the Rand goldfields. It was the most expensive British military campaign before World War I, and killed tens of thousands on all sides. The Berlin Conference had set the legal framework that made this competition over African resources the central dynamic of Southern African politics. France emerged from the Berlin Conference with the largest single block of African territory, approximately 10.9 million square kilometers when you include North Africa. And France's approach to colonialism was, in its own way, as consequential as Britain's. French colonial ideology was centered on the concept of assimilation, the idea that African peoples could become, in effect, French, by adopting the French language, French culture, French values, French education. The colonial project was framed as cultural rescue, bringing the benefits of French civilization to uncivilized peoples. In practice, this policy was applied to very few people. Full French citizenship was available only to those who met stringent cultural and educational criteria, which effectively excluded the vast majority of France's African subjects. But the ideology produced a distinctive intellectual tradition. Negritude, a literary and intellectual movement developed by African and Caribbean intellectuals educated in Paris, who used the French language to articulate African cultural pride and challenge colonial ideology. Léopold Sédar Senghor, Aimé Césaire, they used the colonizers' language as a weapon against colonization. The Fashoda crisis of 1898 is worth noting. Britain and France nearly went to war over a stretch of the Upper Nile in Sudan. A French expedition had arrived at Fashoda to block British expansion. A British force arrived shortly after. For months, two major European powers were on the brink of military conflict over a dusty stretch of East African riverbank. This shows how literally Berlin's framework played out. The race for effective occupation created conditions for European conflict over African soil. And the CFA franc, 14 African nations today use a currency managed by the French treasury. This is the Berlin Conference's most visible contemporary legacy. Germany emerged from the Berlin Conference with 4 African territories, and produced in those territories what scholars and international bodies now recognize as the first genocide of the 20th century. German Southwest Africa, modern Namibia, was acquired in the scramble that followed Berlin. The Herero and Nama peoples of that territory had their own political systems, their own land, and their own way of life. German colonization disrupted all of this, seizing land, imposing forced labor, and creating the conditions for violent resistance. In 1904, the Herero rose against German colonial rule. Germany's response was commanded by General Lothar von Trotha, who issued the Vernichtungsbefehl, the extermination order. I want to read you the actual words. Every Herero, armed or unarmed, with or without cattle, will be shot. I will no longer accept women and children. I will drive them back to their people, or I will shoot them. This is my decision for the Herero people. This is the most explicit genocide order I am aware of in colonial history. And it was implemented. The Herero were driven into the Omahike Desert, and their water sources were poisoned. An estimated 65,000 of 80,000 Herero were killed. The Nama people, who also resisted, lost approximately 10,000 of 20,000. In 2021, Germany formally acknowledged the Herero and Nama genocide, the first European government to formally acknowledge a colonial genocide, and agreed to provide €1.1 billion in development aid over 30 years. The Herero and Nama communities rejected this settlement as insufficient, arguing for direct reparations rather than development aid. The Herero and Nama genocide happened because the Berlin Conference created a legal framework that gave Germany sovereignty over their territory without their consent, making Germany's management of resistance entirely at German discretion. The Berlin Conference divided Africa on paper, but Africa did not accept what was decided on that paper. African resistance to colonial conquest was extensive, sustained, and often highly effective. The standard narrative that African peoples simply submitted to European conquest is false. What actually happened was that African resistance was overcome, over time, through European technological superiority, specifically the Maxim gun, the telegraph, and the railway, not through any inherent African inability to resist. Adwa is the most important single military event in African colonial history. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1895, claiming it was a protectorate under a disputed treaty, Emperor Menelik II rejected the claim and mobilized a national army, 100,000 Ethiopian soldiers, against approximately 14,500 Italian troops. At Adwa on March 1, 1896, the Ethiopians destroyed the Italian force. 7,000 Italians killed, 3,000 taken prisoner. The Italian government fell. A peace treaty was signed recognizing full Ethiopian sovereignty. Adwa's significance extended far beyond Ethiopia. It proved that an African army could defeat a European colonial force decisively, in a formal pitched battle, under modern conditions. Pan-African thinkers, Dubois, Nkrumah, Garvey, cited Adwa as proof that African resistance to colonialism could succeed. The Ethiopian flag colors, green, gold, red, were adopted by Pan-African movements worldwide as symbols of African dignity and resistance. The Zulu, Ashanti, Modest Sudan, all fought with sophistication and determination. All were eventually overcome by the asymmetric military advantage of European forces, armed with Maxim guns, and supported by telegraph and railway infrastructure. The question was never African courage or capacity. It was military technology. The Berlin Conference established not just a political framework for colonialism but an economic one. And that economic framework extraction is perhaps the conference's most enduring and most damaging legacy. The colonial economic logic was simple and deliberate. Africa's natural resources and African labor existed to serve European industrial development. The role of the colonial economy was to extract raw materials cheaply through a combination of forced labor, tax systems that compelled Africans to enter the monetary economy as workers, and legal structures that excluded Africans from ownership of the most valuable productive assets, and shipped those materials to European factories. Leopold's rubber is the purest expression of this logic. Wild rubber from the Congo jungle, extracted by Congolese people under the threat of violence, shipped to European markets, used in European bicycles and industrial equipment. The Congolese people who tapped the rubber lived in terror and poverty. Leopold built palaces and filled art galleries. South Africa's gold and diamond industries followed the same logic. Black South African miners extracted the wealth that financed the growth of the most advanced economy in Africa and were excluded by law from any share in that wealth. The migrant labor system, the compound system, the pass laws, and eventually apartheid were all designed to maintain the supply of cheap black labor for mining while preventing black economic advancement. Ghana grows 20% of the world's cocoa. It receives approximately 2% of the value of the global chocolate market. The chocolate, the processing, the branding, the retail, happens in Europe and North America. Ghana grows the raw material. Europe captures the value. This is the Berlin Conference's economic logic, still operating in 2025. If you are serious about Africa's future, you must also become serious about personal growth, execution, discipline, entrepreneurship, and building. Knowledge without implementation changes nothing. That is exactly why I'm building the Griot Wave Inner Circle, an execution-focused community for builders, creators, entrepreneurs, and purpose-driven individuals. A space focused on accountability, implementation, entrepreneurship, transformation, AI and digital leverage, community, and real progress. Weekly live sessions, execution systems, focused builders, real conversations, real growth. If you are tired of consuming endlessly and ready to start building intentionally, scan the QR code or use the link below to join the early interest list. Stop consuming, start building. Don't build alone. Join the Griot Wave Inner Circle and connect with a community focused on real execution and transformation. Scan the QR code to begin. I want to spend a moment with the Congo specifically because it is the most thoroughly documented, most thoroughly photographed, and most thoroughly written about atrocity of the colonial era. And it is the most direct consequence of what the Berlin Conference decided. The conference gave Leopold personal sovereignty over 2.3 million square kilometers. He ran it as a rubber extraction operation. Between 1885 and 1908, the Congolese population fell by approximately 10 million people. Half. The population of the Congo was cut in half by one man's greed, enabled by 13 nations' legal framework. The photographs. Missionaries in the Congo began taking photographs in the 1890s and sending them back to Europe. These were among the first international human rights photographs. Images of Congolese children with severed hands, of bodies, of the direct physical evidence of systematic atrocity. When these images reached European newspapers, They created a moral crisis that Leopold's lobbying could not fully suppress. E.D. Morel was not a famous journalist or a powerful politician. He was a shipping clerk. He noticed something in the shipping manifests. Ships going to the Congo carried guns and ammunition. Ships coming back carried rubber. But there were no trade goods, the things you would expect if rubber were being purchased in exchange. No cloth, no tools, no merchandise. Just weapons going in, rubber coming out. He understood what this meant. The rubber was not being traded for. It was being taken by force. Morel quit his job, founded the Congo Reform Association, and launched what became, arguably, the world's first successful international human rights campaign. He ultimately won. International pressure forced Leopold to hand the Congo over to the Belgian government in 1908. Joseph Conrad sailed the Congo River in 1890. Heart of Darkness is his account of what he saw. It remains one of the most honest literary accounts of colonialism, and of the moral corruption it required of everyone involved. The Berlin Conference's border legacy is not historical in the sense of over and done with. It is active. The borders drawn at and after Berlin are still producing conflict in Sudan, in Nigeria, in the DRC, in Somalia, right now, in 2025. Sudan and South Sudan. Britain drew Sudan's borders to enclose Arab Muslim northerners and African Christian and animist southerners within a single state. These populations had different languages, different religions, different cultural systems, and different histories. The colonial border lumped them together without any political mechanism for managing their differences. The result was decades of civil war, millions of deaths, and ultimately the birth of South Sudan in 2011, a new nation created to resolve a conflict born in colonial border drawing. Nigeria. Britain assembled Nigeria from dozens of distinct ethnic groups: the Yoruba in the southwest, the Igbo in the southeast, the Hausa Fulani in the north, and hundreds of smaller groups. The colonial administrative structure imposed on this diversity had no organic political legitimacy. The Biafra War of 1967 to 1970, between 1 and 3 million deaths, was the consequence of a state that had never been a unified political community, and whose colonial borders provided no basis for building one. The DRC, over 200 ethnic groups within Berlin-era borders. Near continuous armed conflict since independence in 1960. Millions of deaths in eastern Congo since 1994. The United Nations has called it the deadliest conflict since World War II. Somalia, divided among 5 colonial jurisdictions. A people with a shared language and culture fragmented by borders that made no political or geographic sense. The Somali state collapsed in 1991. It has not recovered. Every conflict in the Horn of Africa traces its roots to these borders. Let me talk about language, because it is one of the most intimate and most persistent of the Berlin Conference's legacies, and it is also one of the most philosophically profound. Africa is the world's most linguistically diverse continent. Between 1,500 and 2,000 distinct languages, approximately 30% of all the world's languages. These are not primitive communication systems. They are complex, grammatically rich, philosophically sophisticated languages, many with literary traditions, and some with their own writing systems. They encode millennia of knowledge about African environments, social systems, cosmologies, and ways of being human. The colonial project imposed European languages as the medium of governance, law, education, and formal commerce. The practical reason was administrative. It was easier to govern through a single European language than to learn hundreds of African ones. The political reason was control. Access to the formal institutions of the colonial state required literacy in the colonial language, creating a small, educated elite dependent on the colonizer's language for their social advancement. Ngugi W. Thiong'o put it precisely. The colonial language was not merely a practical tool, it was a cognitive colonization. When you make people think, dream, and reason in your language, you orient their minds toward your frameworks of value, your ways of knowing, your cultural assumptions. The African child educated in English or French is educated primarily in European intellectual traditions. Today, African children in most of the continent are educated primarily in languages that are not their home languages. Decades of research shows this significantly reduces educational effectiveness. Children learn better in their first language. African legal systems are inaccessible to most Africans because they operate in European languages. This is the Berlin Conference's linguistic inheritance, still shaping who has access to power and how Africa thinks about itself. The economic legacy of the Berlin Conference is the one that is most immediately consequential for African lives today, and it is the one that is most systematically obscured in standard discussions of African development. The colonial economic system was built to extract, not to develop. Every economic decision made in the colonial period, what crops to grow, what minerals to extract, where to build railways, what infrastructure to develop, was made on the basis of what benefited European industries. The railways in Africa almost all run from the interior to the coast, from resource extraction points to export terminals. They were not built to connect African cities to each other. They were built to move African resources to European ships. The monoculture design of African colonial economies was deliberate. If you orient an entire economy toward exporting a single raw material, cocoa, cotton, copper, you make it entirely dependent on the prices set in European commodity markets, entirely vulnerable to price fluctuations, and entirely without the domestic manufacturing capacity that generates employment, wealth, and economic resilience. The structural adjustment programs of the 1980s took this extraction logic into the post-colonial era. In exchange for debt relief, African governments were required to cut social spending, privatize state enterprises, remove trade protections, and open their markets to foreign competition, precisely the conditions that prevented them from developing the protected industries that today's developed countries use to industrialize. The cocoa paradox is the purest contemporary expression of this legacy. Ghana grows your chocolate. It receives 3% of what you pay for it. The Berlin Conference established this arrangement. It is still operating. 1960. The Year of Africa. 17 nations gained independence in a single year. The most dramatic political transformation the African continent had experienced since the Berlin Conference divided it 76 years earlier. On September 20, 1960, 16 newly independent African nations joined the United Nations simultaneously. This is the most nations ever admitted in a single day. The symbolic power of this moment cannot be overstated. African flags, African diplomats, African voices in the halls of international institutions from which they had been excluded. What did independence change? Genuinely, the political administration. European colonial officials were replaced by African governments. African political parties organized, competed, and governed. African universities were established. African cultural expression was no longer subject to colonial censorship. African foreign policy was no longer determined in London or Paris. What did independence not change? The borders, identical to the Berlin-era colonial boundaries. The official languages, European. The economic structures, still oriented toward raw material export. The legal systems, inherited from the colonial period. The terms of trade, still systematically unfavorable to African producers. Nkrumah understood this immediately. His concept of neocolonialism argued that formal political independence without economic sovereignty was a trap. You are declared free, while the mechanisms of your dependence remain intact. He was overthrown in 1966 by a CIA-backed coup, partly because his analysis was correct, and his policies were acting on it. The OAU's 1963 decision to maintain colonial borders was genuinely difficult. The alternative, redrawing borders to match African political realities, would have produced decades of conflict. But the consequence of maintaining those borders has been 60 years of political instability, rooted in the mismatch between colonial administrative units and African political communities. Nkrumah coined the term neocolonialism in 1965 to describe what he saw happening: Africa gaining political independence while the structures of economic control remained intact. Half a century later, his diagnosis looks even more accurate than it did at the time. The CFA franc, 14 African nations, home to approximately 180 million people, use a currency that is pegged to the euro and managed with French treasury involvement. When the arrangement was reformed in 2020, it was presented as a significant change. France would no longer require its African partners to hold reserves in Paris. But French involvement in monetary policy consultation continues. The fundamental dependency, African monetary policy shaped by European institutional preferences, remains. Military bases. France maintains 8 permanent military bases in Africa. The United States established AFRICOM in 2007. The argument is partnership and security cooperation. But the asymmetry, powerful external military forces with permanent presence on African soil, operating under agreements that African governments can cancel only at significant political and security cost, is a continuation of the Berlin-era principle that African territory is available for European and American strategic use. Illicit financial flows. $88 billion per year leaves Africa through a combination of corporate tax avoidance, mispriced intracompany trade, and corruption. This is more than the total official development aid that Africa receives. The mineral wealth of the DRC's eastern region, cobalt, coltan, gold, finances European and American technology industries, while the Congolese people who live above those minerals remain among the world's poorest. Nkrumah's 1965 analysis. The essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent, and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system, and thus its political policy, is directed from outside. This description remains accurate for a significant portion of the African continent. Why does a conference held 140 years ago, in Berlin, still matter in 2025? Let me count the ways. First, the borders. Every African political conflict that involves disputed territory, ethnic tension, or secessionist movements traces to borders drawn at or after Berlin. In 2025, these conflicts are active. The ongoing war in eastern DRC, the conflict in Ethiopia's Tigray region, the Cameroonian Anglophone crisis, the Sahelian security crisis across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. All of these have roots in Berlin-era border drawing. The conference is not finished. It is still producing casualties. Second, reparations. The question of what European nations owe Africa for colonialism, including for what the Berlin Conference specifically established, is a live political and legal debate. Germany's 2021 acknowledgement of the Herero and Nama genocide and commitment of €1.1 billion establishes the principle that such acknowledgement and commitment is possible. CARICOM's formal request to European governments is still pending response. The reparations conversation is happening, and it will not stop. Third, the AFCFTA. This is Africa's institutional response to Berlin. By creating a continental free trade area of 1.3 billion people, African nations are attempting to build the economic sovereignty that political independence never fully delivered. The AFCFTA is explicitly designed to counter the raw material export orientation that the colonial period established. Fourth, Pan-Africanism and the African Union. Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Patrice Lumumba, the great Pan-African thinkers understood that the Berlin Conference's logic had to be countered by African unity. The African Union, however imperfect, represents Africa's attempt to govern itself collectively as a direct political counter to the Berlin Conference's framework. 5 myths. Direct answers. Myth 1. Berlin physically drew Africa's borders. Wrong. Berlin established the legal framework and the effective occupation doctrine. The actual borders were drawn in bilateral European treaties during the Scramble, but they were all enabled by what Berlin decided. Berlin created the rules. The Scramble drew the lines under those rules. Myth 2. Berlin was humanitarian, ending slavery and civilizing Africa. The humanitarian provisions were not enforced. Leopold's Congo, the conference's most direct product, killed 10 million people. The humanitarian language was strategic decoration. Myth 3. Africa had no political structures. 90% was under African governance in 1880. Ethiopia, Zulu, Ashanti, Dahomey, sophisticated states. Berlin destroyed an existing order. Myth 4. Colonialism benefited Africa through infrastructure and education. The railways went from mines to ports. The education produced clerks. The medicine maintained the workforce. No colonial power's balance sheet, examined honestly, shows benefit to colonized Africans. Myth 5. African nations have accepted colonial borders. They have accommodated them pragmatically. The 1963 OAU decision was a choice under constraint. The debate is not closed. South Sudan demonstrates that borders can change. The question is cost, not principle. Your reference card, the Berlin Conference in 15 Facts. A few things I want you to notice. The Transformation Row, 1880 90% African governance, 1914 90% European colonial rule, 34 years, 1 generation. The fastest geopolitical transformation in the history of the modern world. The Leopold Row, 2.3 million square kilometers to 1 man, 10 million dead. First modern genocide. The Berlin Conference made this possible. The Border Legacy Row, 177 groups divided. Still producing conflict in 2025. This is not ancient history. It is this week's news from the DRC, from the Sahel, from the Horn of Africa. And the Africa's Response Row, AFCFTA, African Union, Pan-Africanism. Africa building its own institutional counter to the Berlin framework, 140 years later. 8 takeaways. 1. November 1884 to February 1885. 13 European powers, 0 African representatives. The legal framework for the colonization of a continent, decided without the continent's people. 2. Effective occupation triggered the Scramble, 1,880 to 90% African governance. 1,914 to 90% European colonial rule. 34 years. 1 generation. 3. Leopold. 2.3 million square kilometers to 1 man. 10 million dead. First modern genocide. Made possible by the conference. 4. African resistance was extensive and sophisticated. Adwa. Isandlwana. The Ashanti Wars. The modest state. Overcome by the Maxim gun. Not by any failure of African capability. 5. Berlin's borders are still producing casualties in 2025. Sudan. DRC. Nigeria. Somalia. The Sahel. 177 cultural groups divided. The conference is not finished. 6. The economic legacy. Monoculture. Extraction. Debt. Ghana grows 20% of the world's cocoa. Gets 3% of the value. Still operating. 7. 6 European languages official in 54 states. 2,000 plus African languages marginalized. Cognitive as well as political colonization. 8. Africa is building the counter. AFCFTA. African Union. Reparations. Berlin divided. Africa is choosing integration. What does the Berlin Conference's history require of us? 4 things. First, teach the full history. The Berlin Conference is not in most European or American school curricula. Contemporary students, who will be voters, investors, politicians, business leaders, are making decisions about aid to Africa, trade with Africa, foreign policy toward Africa, and the African people who are in their countries as migrants and refugees, without any historical framework for understanding why Africa is in the position it is in. This is not a trivial educational gap. It produces policy that is based on a false premise, that African underdevelopment is natural or cultural, rather than the accurate premise that it is a documented, measurable consequence of what was done to Africa at Berlin and after. Second, acknowledge specific crimes. Germany set the precedent in 2021 by formally acknowledging the Herero and Nama genocide. Belgium has not formally acknowledged the Congo atrocities. Britain has not formally acknowledged the Mau Mau torture, the Bengal famine, or dozens of other colonial crimes. France has not acknowledged Algeria, Madagascar, or Cameroon. The precedent exists. The question is political will. Third, reform the economic framework. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. These institutions operate under rules that systematically disadvantage African producers and systematically advantage European and American corporations and financial institutions. Reform is possible. It requires political commitment from the powerful nations that dominate these institutions. Fourth, support African sovereignty, genuinely. No more foreign military bases, without genuine African consent. No more loan conditionalities that limit African government choices. African leadership of African development. I want to close the substantive section of this video with the African response to Berlin, because the history of the Berlin Conference is not only a history of what was done to Africa, it is also a history of African political consciousness, African intellectual resistance, and African institution building. Pan-Africanism was born from the colonial experience. Du Bois' 1919 Pan-African Congress, convened in Paris at the same time as the Peace Conference that was reinforcing colonial arrangements after World War I, established the principle: African and diaspora Africans would build their own political movement, argue their own case, and pursue African self-determination through political organization. Nkrumah took this tradition and made it foundational to African independence. His "Africa must unite or perish" is not rhetorical flourish. It is a geopolitical assessment. Individual African nations, small economies, colonial borders, few resources, cannot negotiate as equals with global powers. Only a unified Africa, with the collective weight of a continent, can. Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966. The United States of Africa he envisioned has not been achieved. But the direction of travel he indicated, continental unity, African determined economic policy, collective political institutions, is the direction that the AFCFTA and the African Union represent. The AFCFTA in 2021 is the most significant economic step toward the African economic sovereignty that the Berlin Conference denied. 1.3 billion people, $3 trillion GDP, 54 nations agreeing to trade with each other first, rather than defaulting to trade with former colonial powers. Berlin divided Africa in 1884. Africa is choosing integration in 2025. The Berlin Conference is not the last word on Africa's future. They drew lines on a map, without asking a single African. And those lines are still there. 13 European powers gathered in Berlin in November 1884. They spread a map of Africa across a table. They negotiated among themselves, about spheres of influence, about river navigation rights, about the rules for claiming territory. They produced a legal document, signed it on February 26, 1885, and sent copies to their governments. And then the scramble began. In 34 years, by 1914 to 90% of Africa was under European colonial rule. Kingdom by kingdom, battle by battle, the Maxim gun against the spear. 10 million Congolese dead in Leopold's personal estate. 65,000 Herero killed in Germany's extermination order. British concentration camps in South Africa. French brutality in Algeria, Cameroon, Madagascar. Belgian atrocities across the Congo. 177 cultural groups divided by lines drawn without their knowledge. 6 European languages imposed on a continent of 2,000 indigenous tongues. Economies engineered to export raw materials and import finished goods at European prices, on European terms. And the borders remain, and the languages remain, and the economic structures remain, and the conflicts rooted in all of it remain. But Africa remains too. Ethiopia defeated Italy at Adwa. Yaa Asantewaa told the Ashanti chiefs, If you will not, we will. Nkrumah said, Africa must unite or perish. The AFCFTA is 1.3 billion people choosing to trade with each other. The African Union is 54 nations governing themselves collectively. They drew lines on a map without asking a single African. And those lines are still there. But so is Africa. Subscribe to GrioWave Academy. Share this video. And the next time someone asks why African borders are so straight, now you know why. And you know who drew them. And you know why it matters. Asante sana. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, courses, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode. And this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.